Coronado nights usually end in quiet reflection or loud, boastful sea stories, never in stunned, breathless silence. Yet inside an exclusive dive bar strictly reserved for elite military operators, a heavy whiskey glass shattered against the hardwood floor. A hardened Navy SEAL had just heard a single word that shattered his entire reality. Ocean breezes rolling off the Pacific carried the heavy scent of salt and impending rain, slipping through the cracked front door of McPaw's Irish pub. The establishment in Coronado, California was legendary, serving as the unofficial living room for naval special warfare. It was a place where trident wearers gathered to drown ghosts, celebrate the living, and quietly mourn the fallen. Lieutenant Commander Dalton Hayes sat at the far end of the scarred oak bar, nursing a neat pour of bourbon. Dalton had spent 12 years in the teens, the last 4 operating within the fiercely classified tiers of Def Juru. He was a man composed of sharp angles, quiet intensity, and invisible scars. The pub was moderately crowded for a Tuesday night. Small clusters of men with broad shoulders and short haircuts dominated the wooden booths. The low hum of their conversations was a steady rhythmic murmur of tactical jargon, deployment rumors, and veiled complaints about command structures. The heavy front door swung open, cutting through the ambient noise with a sharp squeak of its rusty hinges. Dalton did not turn his head, but his eyes instinctively shifted to the mirror behind the rows of liquor bottles. A woman walked in. She did not fit the demographic of McPee's. The wives and girlfriends who frequented the establishment usually arrived in groups, their body language relaxed, their laughter piercing the heavy atmosphere. This woman was alone. She was tall, undeniably athletic, dressed in a faded charcoal Henley shirt, dark tactical denim, and scuffed Solomon hiking boots. But it was not her attire that caught Dalton's trained eye. It was her movement. She moved with a fluid, deliberate economy of motion. Her eyes swept the room in less than 3 seconds, registering the exits, identifying the blind spots, and assessing the patrons before she even took her 4th step inside. It was a subconscious habit drilled into the minds of Tier 1 operators. Dalton watched her reflection closely. She chose a stool at the bar exactly 3 seats down from him, placing her back to the solid brick wall, ensuring she had a clear line of sight to the main entrance. Tommy, the gray-haired bartender and a former frogman from the Vietnam era, wiped down the counter in front of her. "What's your poison, miss?" "Lafroig." "Neat. Leave the bottle if you don't mind." Her voice was smooth but carried a raspy edge, like someone who had spent too much time breathing in the arid, throat-shredding air of the Middle East. Dalton took a slow sip of his bourbon. He was intrigued. He had worked with elite women before CIA operatives, Defense Intelligence Agency handlers, and members of the cultural support teams who deployed alongside Rangers and SEALs to interact with local female populations in Afghanistan. They were tough, competent professionals, but there was something distinctly different about the aura radiating from the woman sitting 3 stools away. She possessed the predatory, coiled stillness of a door kicker. He noticed her hands as she wrapped her fingers around the glass of scotch. The knuckles were calloused, the skin marred by faint, silvery scars that looked suspiciously like shrapnel nicks and rope burns from fast roping out of Black Hawks. On her left wrist, she wore a matte black Garmin Tactics watch with the GPS disabled, a staple among Special Operations personnel. "You're scanning the room like you're expecting an ambush," Dalton said, his voice low, designed to travel just far enough to reach her ears over the low din of the bar. The woman did not flinch. She took a sip of her scotch, swallowed, and slowly turned her head to look at him. Her eyes were a piercing, icy shade of gray. "Old habits die hard, Commander." Dalton's brow furrowed slightly. He wasn't wearing his uniform, and there was nothing on his civilian clothing to indicate his rank. "You have me at a disadvantage." "Not really," she replied, a faint ghost of a smile playing on her lips. "You have the posture of an officer who spent too much time carrying a rifle before they gave you a desk, and you're drinking the exact same bourbon Master Chief Sullivan swears by. Assuming you run in the same circles as Sullivan, that puts you at a command level in a highly specialized group." Dalton let out a quiet, genuine chuckle. He shifted his weight, turning slightly toward her. "You're observant. I'll give you that." "I'm Dalton." "Celine," she said, nodding once. "So, Celine," Dalton continued, leaning his forearms on the bar, What brings a sharp-eyed analyst to a dive bar in Coronado? UDIA, CIA Special Activities. You don't look like the usual brass from Langley. Celine stared at the amber liquid in her glass. Something like that. I'm passing through, visiting some old stomping grounds. Coronado? Dalton pressed, his curiosity shifting into a mild interrogation. The only thing out here is the beach, the tourists, and the base. And you don't strike me as a tourist. I spent some time on the base, she answered vaguely. A few years back. Dalton nodded, piecing together a logical narrative in his head. The Pentagon had opened all combat roles to women a few years prior. Since then, a handful of exceptional women had attempted the grueling basic underwater demolition sail training. A rumor mill in the Navy was constantly buzzing with stories of female candidates making it to the second or third phase, but the official word was always the same. None had successfully completed the pipeline and earned the Trident. The first told the sheer brutality of Hell Week had proven an insurmountable barrier. Dalton assumed Celine was likely support personnel attached to naval special warfare. Perhaps an intelligence officer who had done a temporary assignment in the compound. Support staff? Dalton asked gently, trying not to sound condescending. We appreciate the overwatch. God knows the intel geeks have saved my ass more times than I can count. Celine's grey eyes locked onto his. There was no anger in her expression, only a chilling, profound calm. I don't do intelligence, Dalton, and I prefer to provide my overwatch a little closer to the ground. The air between them seemed to drop a few degrees. The casual banter was dissolving, replaced by an unspoken tension. Two predators were circling each other, trying to establish the hierarchy in the room. Dalton felt a strange sense of familiarity. He had seen that exact look in the eyes of his most lethal teammates before a high-value target raid. It was the look of someone who had looked into the abyss, crossed the line of morality for the sake of the mission, and returned permanently changed. The pub grew slightly louder as a group of younger SEALs from Team 3 walked in, dropping their heavy bags by the door and calling out to Tommy for pitchers of beer. Dalton ignored them, keeping his attention solely on Celine. Closer to the ground, Dalton echoed, swirling the ice in his glass. That's a bold statement. You're talking like someone who has spent time outside the wire. Real time. I've seen enough sand to last a lifetime, Celine replied, taking another measured sip of her Lafroig. I've operated in environments where the chain of command was a suggestion and the extraction was always late. Dalton leaned back, crossing his arms. He was a Tier 1 operator, a man who had survived the most brutal combat environments on Earth. He wasn't one to be easily impressed by cryptic remarks. Everybody has sea stories, Celine. Some just tell them better than others. But in this community, the truth always comes out in the wash. You claim you operate outside the wire. Fine. Where? Where? Syria, she answered without hesitation. Al-Hasaka province, northern Iraq. The Koringal before they shut it down. Pick a sandbox. Dalton's heart skipped a beat at the mention of Al-Hasaka. It was a remote, violently unstable region in northeastern Syria. 3 years ago, Dalton had led a joint task force raid deep into an ISIS stronghold in that exact province. It was a mission that officially never happened, a catastrophic cluster of bad intelligence and overwhelming enemy force. Al-Hasaka, Dalton repeated, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The ambient noise of the bar seemed to fade into a dull roar. I was in Al-Hasaka 3 years ago. Operation Black Rain. Celine did not react to the classified mission name. She simply traced the rim of her glass with her index finger. I know. Dalton's muscles tensed. He slowly uncrossed his arms, his body shifting into a highly alert state. How do you know that? I know that your helo was forced to abort the landing because of RPG fire, Celine said, her voice steady, devoid of emotion. I know your team call sign Bravo 2 was forced to fast rope into a courtyard surrounded by 50 heavily armed hostiles. I know your radio man, Miller, took a round to the femoral artery within the first 2 minutes, and you were pinned down behind a crumbling mud wall with 0 air support because a sandstorm grounded the Apaches. Dalton stared at her, utterly paralyzed. The details she was rattling off were highly classified. Only the surviving members of his team, the JSOC commander, and the immediate debriefing officers knew the exact tactical nightmare that had unfolded in that courtyard. "Who the hell are you?" Dalton demanded, his voice thick with a sudden overwhelming mix of anger and shock. "Are you with the Pentagon? An auditor?" "I told you I don't do intel, and I certainly don't do paperwork," Celine replied softly. Dalton leaned in close, his face inches from hers. "If you know about the courtyard, then you know how we got out." "I do," she said. Dalton closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, the memories flooding back with violent clarity. The deafening crack of AK-47 fire, the smell of cordite, Miller's agonizing screams, the suffocating heat of the Syrian night. They were dead men walking. They were out of ammunition, surrounded and waiting for the final breach. And then the heavens had opened up. A single, unseen sniper had begun dropping the insurgents from a position somewhere in the hills overlooking the city. The shots were impossible. Fired from a staggering distance through howling crosswinds and blinding dust, the heavy-caliber rounds had struck with devastating, methodical precision. Every time an enemy fighter stepped into the open to fire an RPG, their head vanished in a mist of red. The sniper had maintained a relentless, punishing rhythm for 45 minutes, breaking the enemy siege and giving Dalton's team the exact window they needed to drag Miller to a secondary extraction point. When Dalton had returned to base, covered in dirt and his teammates' blood, he had stormed into the Tactical Operations Center to find out who had provided the angelic overwatch. The commander had refused to give a name, stating only that a highly classified solo asset had been operating in the sector. The only thing Dalton learned was the asset's call sign. "There was an operator on the ridge that night," Dalton whispered to Celine, his hands gripping the edge of the bar. "A solo element. A ghost. That sniper single-handedly dismantled an entire platoon of fighters and saved my team. We never found out his name. We never got to buy him a beer. The wind wasn't a standard cross breeze," Celine said quietly, looking up from her glass to meet Dalton's intense gaze. "It was a cyclonic updraft coming from the river valley, gusting erratically between 12 and 18 knots, adjusting for the spin drift and the Coriolis effect at 1,600 meters with that kind of wind shear. It requires a specific holdover. You have to aim 4 feet high and 6 feet to the left of the target." Dalton stopped breathing. The pub, the music, the laughter of the younger SEALs, it all evaporated. The technical details of the ballistics she had just described were not something an intelligence analyst would know. It was the visceral mathematical reality of the person looking through the scope. Dalton's hand trembled as he reached for his whiskey glass. He lifted it an inch off the coaster. His mind was violently rejecting the conclusion staring him in the face. The legendary asset, the mythical operator who had passed the vetting, survived the pipeline in total secrecy, and pulled off the greatest shooting exhibition Dalton had ever witnessed. "Who are you?" Dalton choked out, the words scraping against his throat. "What is your call sign?" Celine looked at him, her grey eyes reflecting the dim, amber lights of the bar. She didn't blink. "Outlaw 3, she said. Dalton's fingers went numb. The heavy whiskey glass slipped from his grasp, plummeting toward the earth, shattering into 100 jagged pieces against the hardwood floor. Tommy paused his wiping, glancing sharply over the bar at the shattered remnants of the heavy tumbler. The sharp, violent sound of breaking glass had momentarily silenced the immediate vicinity of the pub. Conversations at nearby tables abruptly halted, and a few of the younger SEALs near the door turned their heads, their hands instinctively dropping toward their hips in a conditioned response to sudden noise. "You good, Commander?" Tommy asked, his rough voice cutting through the sudden quiet. He reached beneath the counter for a small broom and dustpan. "I'm fine, Tommy," Dalton managed to say, his voice tight and strained. He waved a dismissive hand toward the younger operators, silently signaling that everything was under control. "Put the glass on my tab, and keep the bottle over here." Celine sat perfectly still. She did not flinch, nor did she offer to help clean the mess. Her posture remained relaxed, her hands resting lightly on the scarred oak of the bar. She watched Dalton with a detached, clinical patience as he processed the impossible realities sitting right beside him. Dalton forced himself to take a deep, stabilizing breath. He leaned heavily against the bar, his mind racing through years of naval regulations, classified briefings, and the rigid, unbending structure of naval special warfare. "That's impossible," Dalton whispered, his voice laced with absolute denial. "The Pentagon didn't even clear women for direct combat roles until a few years ago. And even then, nobody has made it through the pipeline here in Coronado. Nobody gets a trident without ringing the bell or crossing the grinder." "You don't exist. I never claimed to wear a trident, Dalton," Celine replied smoothly, pouring herself another finger of Lafroy. "Bud S is a sledgehammer. It is designed to forge a very specific type of weapon for a very specific type of conventional, unconventional warfare. The brass needed a sledgehammer, so they built the grinder. But sometimes the intelligence community doesn't need a sledgehammer. Sometimes they need a scalpel." Dalton stared at her, the pieces slowly beginning to align in his analytical mind. "A special access program. Project Valkyrie," Celine confirmed, her grey eyes darkening with the weight of unspeakable memories. "It was a highly compartmentalized joint initiative between JSOC and the CIA's Special Activities Center. They realized that sending a 6'2", 200-pound American male with a high and tight haircut into certain denied areas in the Middle East or Eastern Europe was an instant compromise. They needed solo operatives who could blend in, who could bypass standard security perimeters, and who possessed Tier 1 kinetic capabilities." Dalton rubbed his jaw, the shock giving way to a profound, professional curiosity. "Where did they train you? If you didn't come through Coronado, who vetted you?" "I was recruited out of a specialized intelligence unit," she explained, her tone devoid of boastfulness. "I already had a background in competitive long-range precision shooting. They pulled me off the grid for 18 months. We trained at a black site deep in the mountains of West Virginia, far away from the politics of standard military commands. It wasn't about carrying heavy logs or freezing in the surf zone. It was about isolation, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. They pushed us to the absolute brink of human endurance psychologically and physically to see who would break. Out of 40 hand-selected female candidates, I was the only one who finished." Dalton listened, utterly captivated. He knew the rumors of such programs existed, whispers of female operatives trained to the exact same lethal standards as Delta Force or Devja, operating entirely off the books in the darkest corners of the globe. "They embedded me with a Delta detachment in Iraq for my initial combat rotation," Celine continued, staring blankly at the wall of liquor bottles. "After I proved I wouldn't freeze under fire, they pushed me into solo Overwatch roles. Syria, Yemen, places where American footprints officially didn't exist. Which brings us to Al-Hasaka." Dalton felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The memory of that night was a permanent, burning scar on his psyche. "You were on the ridge. You were Outlaw 3. "I was in a hide site 12 miles outside the city limits," Celine corrected him gently. "I had been tracking a high-value ISIS facilitator for 3 days, operating in complete radio silence. I was dug into a rocky outcropping, surviving on minimal water, waiting for my target to move. That's when I intercepted the frantic radio traffic from Bravo 2. Dalton closed his eyes. He could still hear Miller's desperate voice over the comms, pleading for air support that never came. "I heard your element take contact," Celine said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I heard the Apaches get grounded by the sandstorm. I had a direct line of sight down into the valley. I could see the muzzle flashes lighting up the courtyard. I scoped in and saw 50 fighters closing in on a compromised 6-man squad. You were trapped. We were dead," Dalton corrected her softly. "We were out of primary ammunition. We had transitioned to sidearms. We were just waiting for the walls to fall." "I broke radio silence," Celine revealed, turning to face him fully. "I contacted the JSOC Tactical Operations Center and requested permission to engage and provide covering fire for your element." Dalton's brow furrowed in confusion. "Permission? You saved our lives. Why would you need permission to engage a hostile force actively attempting to overrun American operators?" "Because you weren't my mission," Celine stated coldly. "My target was the facilitator. Command told me that engaging the courtyard would compromise my hide site and alert my primary target. They ordered me to maintain radio silence, hold my position, and stand down. The pub around them seemed to vanish entirely." Dalton felt a sickening wave of betrayal wash over him. His own command, the people sitting safely in an air-conditioned operations center miles away, had actively decided to let Bravo 2 die in that dirt courtyard. They ordered you to abandon us, Dalton choked out, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the bar. They deemed Bravo 2 a tactical loss, Celine confirmed, her jaw tightening. They told me that extracting a highly classified experimental asset was a higher priority than attempting to save a compromised squad. The operations officer explicitly ordered me to let you die. Tension crackled in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Dalton stared at the woman beside him, realizing the immense, terrifying gravity of the choice she had been forced to make in the dark, sweltering hills of Syria. "But you didn't stand down," Dalton said, his voice trembling with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. "I cut my comms," Celine said simply. "I disabled my GPS tracker, chambered a .338 Lapua Magnum round, and squeezed the trigger. I fired 42 rounds in 45 minutes. I suppressed the enemy advance long enough for you to drag your radio man to the secondary extraction point. By the time I displaced from my hide site, my primary target had vanished, and my career was effectively over." Dalton felt a profound, overwhelming sense of debt. He owed this phantom operator his life, his career, and the lives of his 5 teammates. "You saved us. You disobeyed a direct order to save men you had never even met." "I did what was right," Celine replied, her gaze unwavering. "But the military doesn't reward disobedience, Dalton. Especially not in off-the-books programs. When I got back to base, I was immediately detained. They stripped me of my gear, revoked my security clearance, and threatened me with a secret court-martial for insubordination and compromising a Tier 1 mission." "Why didn't they court-martial you?" Dalton demanded, anger boiling over. "If they wanted to bury you, why let you walk away?" "Because a court-martial requires paperwork," Celine said, a bitter smile touching her lips. "It requires acknowledging that Project Valkyrie exists. It requires admitting that they ordered a female sniper to let a DevGrature team get slaughtered. They couldn't afford the political fallout if the story ever leaked to the congressional oversight committees, so they gave me a choice. Take a dishonorable discharge under false manufactured pretenses or disappear entirely. You disappeared," Dalton concluded, realizing why she was dressed like a civilian contractor, carrying herself like a ghost. "I burned my own files," Celine nodded. "I walked away, but I didn't stop working. I just stopped working for them." Dalton stared at the empty space where his whiskey glass had been. The revelation was staggering, but his tactical mind was already searching for the deeper pattern. "If you are a ghost, Celine, why are you here? Why walk into McPee's after 3 years to tell me a story that could get you thrown into a federal black site?" Celine reached into the front pocket of her tactical denim and withdrew a small, matte black encrypted flash drive. She placed it gently on the bar between them. "I didn't come here for a reunion, Dalton," she said, her voice dropping an octave filled with absolute, chilling seriousness. "And I didn't come here for your gratitude." Dalton looked at the flash drive, then up at her. "What is this? For the last 3 years, I've been operating independently, tracking the financial networks of the ISIS cells operating in Al-Hasaka," Celine explained. "I wanted to know how an isolated stronghold managed to perfectly predict the infiltration route of a highly classified Devdra Evangiru element. You weren't ambushed by chance, Dalton. They were waiting for you." Dalton's heart hammered against his ribs. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying your coordinates were leaked," Celine stated. Bravo 2 was intentionally fed to the wolves. Dalton felt the blood drain from his face. "Who? Commander William Foster," Celine said, uttering the name like a curse. "He was the intelligence liaison coordinating the joint task force flights out of northern Iraq. He was running a highly lucrative, deeply illegal weapons smuggling ring using JSOC logistics flights. Bravo 2's infiltration route put your team dangerously close to one of his primary drop zones. It couldn't risk you stumbling onto his operation, so he fed your flight path to the local warlords." Dalton was speechless. Commander Foster was a highly decorated officer, a man currently sitting on a promotion board for a role within the Pentagon. The idea that a commanding officer would sacrifice his own men for profit was a level of treason Dalton could barely comprehend. "The proof is on that drive," Celine continued, tapping the black plastic with her scarred index finger. "Offshore bank accounts, encrypted emails, satellite imagery of the weapons drops. It perfectly aligns with the timeline of Operation Black Rain. I couldn't bring this to the authorities. I don't exist anymore. If I show my face, I'll be arrested before I can even testify. But you," Celine looked at him, her grey eyes burning with an intense, fierce light. "You have the rank, you have the trident, you have the access. You can walk this right into the Naval Criminal Investigative Service and watch Foster burn." Dalton slowly reached out, his fingers closing around the cold, hard plastic of the flash drive. The weight of it felt heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. He looked at the woman sitting beside him, a phantom who had sacrificed her entire existence to save his team, and who had spent the last 3 years hunting in the shadows to bring him the truth. "Why give this to me?" Dalton asked softly. "You could have mailed it to the press. You could have leaked it anonymously." "Because he owes you a debt of blood, Dalton," Celine said, standing up from the bar stool. She tossed a crumpled $50 bill onto the counter to cover her drink. "He tried to murder your team. You deserve the right to pull the trigger on his career." She turned toward the door, her movements silent and fluid. "Celine," Dalton called out, his voice thick with emotion. She paused, looking back over her shoulder. "Thank you," Dalton said. It was a hopelessly inadequate phrase, but it was all he had. "For the ridge. For this. For everything." Celine offered him a small, genuine nod. "Keep your head down, Commander. The wind is changing." With that, the phantom operator pushed open the heavy wooden door, stepping out into the cold, driving Coronado rain, disappearing into the darkness as if she had never existed at all. Dalton sat alone at the bar, the encrypted drive gripped tightly in his hand, a new mission burning brightly in his chest. Did you see that ending coming? The shadows of the military hold secrets deeper than the ocean, and true heroes rarely wear medals on their chests. If this intense tale of loyalty, betrayal, and ultimate sacrifice kept you entirely on the edge of your seat, smash that like button, share the story with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable real-life operator stories.